In my previous video, I have shared with you that as our human body is one, similarly, the church, the body of the Lord Jesus Christ, is also one. As the human body has many parts or many members, similarly, the church, the body of the Lord Jesus Christ, also has many parts or many members. We have also looked at the importance of verse 18, 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 18. We have learned that God has arranged the parts in the body, every one of them just as He wanted them to be. Now, what are these parts or what are these members that God has arranged in the church? Well, we are going to look at these parts or these members in this video. But before we do that, let me just say two things. First, we are not going to look at these parts or these members in detail or in depth. We are simply going to go through these parts or these members, and I'm going to make a few comments as we go through. And second, we are not going to look at or interpret these parts from any specific denominational perspectives or from any specific denominational views. We are not going to do that. My plan is to look at these parts, look at these members, look at the words for these parts, these members in the Greek text, try to find out what they mean and simply move on. That's the plan. Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 28. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 28. And in the church, God has appointed, first of all, apostles, second, prophets, third, teachers, then workers of miracles, also those having gifts of healing, those able to help others, those with gifts of administration, and those speaking in different kinds of tongues. Now, if you count the numbers, you will find that Paul here speaks of 8 different parts or 8 different members that God has appointed in the church. Let's go through these parts one at a time. First, apostles. An apostle is a special messenger who has been commissioned and has been authorized by the Lord Jesus Himself to fulfill a particular role. During the New Testament times, we see that the apostles went around proclaiming the gospel message. An apostle like Paul, who considered himself as the least of the apostles because he persecuted the church of God, was also involved in breaking grounds and in planting churches. Second, prophets. A prophet is someone who, under inspiration, proclaims utterances on behalf of God. We can simply say that a prophet is someone who speaks for God. Third, teachers. A teacher is someone who instructs. A teacher is an instructor. Then, miracles. The word for miracle simply means powerful deeds, great power that is manifested through deeds. Also, gifts of healing. God gives some people the capacity or the ability, the power to heal or to cure the sick. Helps. Though in this translation, we have those able to help others, but in the Greek text, we have just one word for helps. And the word is plural, not singular. The person to whom this gift is given has this ability to help, to assist, and to direct others. Administrations. Though in this translation, we have those with gifts of administration, but in the Greek text, we have just one word for administrations. Again, the word is plural and not singular. Now, the Greek word for administrations has been used only once in the entire New Testament, and Paul uses this word in 1 Corinthians 12 and in verse 28. This word speaks of the ability to lead and to guide others. The person to whom this gift is given has this leadership ability to lead and to guide others. Kinds of tongues. Though in this translation we have and those speaking in different kinds of tongues, but if you look at the Greek text, this can simply mean or can be translated as kinds of tongues. The word tongues here is probably speaking of ecstatic language or ecstatic speech which need to be interpreted. Keep in mind that the tongues that were spoken on the day of Pentecost, do you remember what happened on the day of Pentecost? The tongues that were spoken on the day of Pentecost were known languages that the people, once they heard, they were able to recognize and understand what has been spoken. We know from Acts chapter 2 that the languages that were spoken were the native languages, the native tongues of the people who had gathered there. For example, there were people from Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Pamphylia, Egypt, visitors from Rome. And there were also other people from other places, and you can read about them in Acts chapter 2. They all heard the wonders of God in their own tongues, in their own languages. Therefore, friends, we need to keep in mind that the tongues that were spoken on the day of Pentecost were known languages that were understandable to people. But in 1 Corinthians 12, Paul is probably speaking of utterances, ecstatic language or ecstatic speech that is not understandable by common people and hence need to be interpreted by those to whom the gift of interpretation is given. Paul here speaks of 8 different parts or 8 different members that God has appointed in the church. First apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, also gifts of healing, helps, administrations, kinds of tongues. Now, the next 2 verses are very important for us to understand. We must clearly understand the next 2 verses because of some of the false teachings that are around us. Let's look at verses 29 and 30. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verses 29 and 30. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all have gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? In the previous verse, in verse 28, Paul has already spoken of apostles and prophets and teachers and workers of miracles and gifts of healing and kinds of tongues. And now, according to this English translation, in verses 29 and 30, Paul goes on to raise some questions. Look at verses 29 and 30 again. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all have gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? See, according to this English translation, the way that Paul has raised these questions, there can only be one answer. And the answer to all these questions is no. No. In fact, according to the Greek text, these verses would sound more like not all apostles, not all prophets, not all teachers, not all work miracles, not all have gifts of healing, not all speak in tongues, all interpret. Let me ask you, as you are watching this video, what do you think? What do you think? Are all apostles? Are all prophets? What do you think? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? What do you think? Do all have gifts of healing? What do you think? Do all have gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? What do you think? All interpret? What's your answer going to be? As I've mentioned to you before, that according to the Greek text, not all apostles, not all prophets, not all teachers, not all work miracles, not all have gifts of healing, not all speak in tongues, all interpret. Friends, let's be very clear over here because there are so many false teachings and misunderstandings that are out there. We need to be absolutely clear on this. Not everyone has been called to be an apostle. By the way, we do not have any apostles today in the strictest sense of the word apostle. And yet lots of people are calling themselves apostles. Keep in mind what Paul is saying here. Not all apostles. Not everyone has been called to be a prophet. And yet lots of people are calling themselves prophets. Have you noticed how many so-called prophets we have today? No wonder we have so many false prophecies, because we have so many false prophets. You know, before we address a person, someone may choose to refer to a person as Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so. But you know what has happened today? Nowadays, in some Christian circles, it has become, if I can use the term, fashionable to call a person apostle so-and-so and prophet so-and-so. By the way, most of these so-called apostles and so-called prophets are self-appointed and self-claimed. According to my observation, people claiming to be apostles and prophets are growing today, growing in numbers. Not everyone has been called to be a teacher. And when people call themselves teachers, but they have not been given the gift of teaching, guess what? We end up with false teachers. And today, we have no shortages of false teachers. Not everyone can work miracles. Not everyone can work miracles. But there are people who are teaching that if you are a believer, you can work miracles. And yet, according to Paul, not all work miracles. That's according to Paul. Not all work miracles. Not everyone has the gifts of healing. Again, there are people and there are churches who are teaching that if you're a believer, you should go and heal the sick and raise the dead. They say that the believers have been given the authority. But what is Paul saying here in this verse? What is Paul saying? Not all have gifts of healing. No wonder today we have so many so-called miracles and so-called healings that are not real. Now, that does not mean that we should not pray for the sick. That does not mean that we should not pray when someone comes to us and asks for prayer, or maybe when we are sick. We should pray for the sick. But we need to keep in mind that not all have gifts of healing. Not everyone can speak in tongues. In verse 30, in 1 Corinthians 12, according to Paul, not all speak in tongues. According to Paul, all interpret. Friends, I am not saying all these. I'm not saying all these, but I am just going through what Paul has already said in verses 29 and 30 in 1 Corinthians 12. Let me encourage you to do your own personal study. There are many people today who have been spoon-fed for too long. Please do your own study. Let me encourage you to be very discerning because of the time that we are living in. We are living during this time when deception is growing like wildfire. Be careful. Watch out. What we have learned in this video is that according to 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 28, God has appointed 8 parts or 8 members in the church. What are these parts or what are these members that God has appointed? First apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, also gifts of healing, helps, administrations, kinds of tongues. We have also learned very clearly from verses 29 and 30 that not all are called to be apostles, not all are called to be prophets, not all are called to be teachers, not all can work miracles, not all have gifts of healing, not all can speak in tongues. All interpret? Not all. Let me encourage you to go through these verses again and do your own personal study.